In our previous episode, we explored the essential nature of prayer and found it to be a meeting of heart and mind in a person's inner yearning to connect with God. And we learned how the central component of tefillah is kavanat halev, direction of the heart, where a person clears their headspace of any extraneous thoughts and then sees themselves as if they're standing in the presence of the Shekhinah, the loving presence between God and Israel. And yet, Jewish prayer is not one big kumbaya, right? There are all these details about which specific things to say, when and how to say them, and there are whole volumes of intricate law governing the whole experience. Where's the bridge between that loving meditation and the tedious prayer book we have today? And how can we travel that bridge in a successful and vital way? I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. Welcome back to the show. So, there's more to prayer than freestyle meditation. The Talmud records that there are actually three distinct stages of the tefillah process, known as shevach, bakasha, and hoda'ah, or praise, request, and thanks or acknowledgement. And that these three aspects of prayer constitute the essential components of the mitzvah of tefillah. Each one should be there as part of what a person does when they direct their heart and mind towards God. So let's take a little bit of a look into these three ingredients and see what they each consist of in a deeper way. So shevach, praise, is where we set the stage, right? Who are we talking to when we're standing in tefillah? You know, there are social institutions surrounding how we speak to people we respect. You wouldn't be granted access to the Oval Office to speak with the president without giving secret security the sense that you're somebody who recognizes the institution of government and the authority and the respect embodied by the president, by the entire institution. And on a personal level, you wouldn't just waltz into the Oval Office either. You'd probably give yourself a little bit of a pep talk, right? Muttering to yourself, okay, Chaim, you're about to meet the president, right? The president of the United States, the one who's the most powerful in the world. I mean, why are you telling yourself that when you already know? Because you're letting the magnitude of the concept of that moment sink in from your abstract knowledge into your experiential consciousness, into your own awareness. It takes emotional realization to get into the experience of where you are and what you're doing. This isn't just another meeting. You're in the presence of the president. And when we're dealing with God, you're in the presence of God, the great, powerful, awesome creator of everything. And that creator has a loving relationship with you and your forefathers and has promised that our people will continue thriving and developing until we reach a state of penultimate perfection. And you're talking to him right now. That same God who imbues life into all things, who controls the climate, conducts nature with his steady, unchanging will, and who at the same time and with the same love supports the downtrodden, heals the sick, and ultimately will restore a whole new vitality to those who live faithfully in the covenant. And you're talking to him right now. He's interested in hearing from you. Could you possibly turn away? So this is what shevach does. Shevach sets the stage for where you are, who you are, and the type of audience that you're privileged to have with your Creator. But then comes the bakasha, which is really the meat and potatoes of prayer, talking about what you came into this audience with God for. And now, I don't mean that in some sort of petty or selfish way. The centerpiece of tefillah, both in its construction and its experience, is sharing our thoughts, our concerns, our desires, and our deepest dreams with God, our ultimate partner in life. In fact, the Rambam actually writes in an early grammar work of his, Milat Higayon, that the word tefillah actually means bakasha, or request. Now, that doesn't only mean things that I need, right? Obviously, that includes the dreams that I have, the struggles that I'm dealing with, concerns with my family or my business or community, whatever deficiencies that I recognize that I need God's help in collaborating with me to achieve those ends are included within the category of bakasha, request. And finally comes the hoda'ah, the thanks or acknowledgement. And this is where I turn to thank God, not only for the opportunity to have spent time sharing and communicating with him, but more deeply, realizing that I'm already blessed with an incredible bounty of goodness within my life as it is, where I restate to myself and to him that in the end of the day, he's always been there for my people. That ultimately our lives are entirely in his hands. That when we take a sober step back and look at things from his perspective, we see it that way. And that's sure, there are obviously so many things wrong and so many areas where I really could use some help. And that in no way contradicts the phenomenal, miraculous goodness that's still there, flowing through my life every single day. And that ultimately, if we could only merit to continue basking in that light of God's loving gaze onto creation, we'd realize that everything that we really need in a deep way would already be fulfilled. And so, closing on that note, we part from God's loving presence with our perspectives realigned and with a fresh sense of purpose and connection as we step out of that presence and back into our regular lives. So how do these three stages happen in practice? So originally, and by that I mean upwards of 2,000 years ago, each person would articulate these parts of prayer entirely on their own. They would create this focused space, then distill their thoughts into clear and composed words, which they would then be able to share with the Almighty. And then they would work their way almost organically through this process of the three stages of tefillah. But the Rambam, the great Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, explains in the first chapter of the Laws of Tefillah that the situation changed for the worse in a fundamental way during the era of the Babylonian exile. Because as the nation of Israel endured exile and mingled with the cultures of Babylonia and Greece and Persia, and a new generation of Jewish people grew up there, for the first time outside of our land, obviously the aspects of culture which are usually naturally retained in a homeland began to slip away. The ability to retain mastery of the language and an intuitive understanding of the nature of tefillah became a pretty rare skill. And so in the times of the return to the Second Temple, around 2,400 years ago, the Supreme Court of Israel at the time, known as the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, or the Men of the Great Assembly, which included 120 of the greatest scholars, along with a bunch of prophets as well, pooled their abilities together and formulated a template for tefillah, comprised of 18 blessings, Shmona Esrei Brachot. And under the leadership of Ezra, a standardized method of tefillah with its own structure and terminology was formalized, which allowed every member of Israel to anchor their own tefillah within the authentic experience. And so what was their guiding light in formulating these blessings? Well, the first three encapsulated the appropriate praise of God, the Shevach component. The last three blessings contained the essential thanks, the recognition, the hoda'ah that we have of the incredible goodness that we receive from God, regardless of whatever else that we receive. And then came time to forming the central 12 blessings. And you can imagine that this would pose somewhat more of a challenge than the beginning or the end, right? I mean, whereas the praise and the thanks, the Shevach and the hoda'ah parts would always be the same for everyone. But people's requests, I mean, those are by definition personal. How do you standardize that? So their approach was actually quite brilliant, and the way the Rambam articulates this is just as beautiful. So his language there in the Laws of Tefillah is, V'ha'emtzayot, what were these middle blessings about? Yesh bahen she'ilat kol hadvarim shehin kemo avot, lechol cheftzei ish ve'ish, uletzarchei hatzibur kulan. They are requests for things which are archetypes, principles, for all of the desires of each and every individual, and for the requirements of the community as a whole. Now, let's unpack that for a second. So the Rambam is saying that these middle blessings, these ones of bakasha, of requests, were written in such a way as to serve as avot, as archetypes, or general categories for the needs of individuals and society alike. So in doing so, Ezra and his court formulated a set of blessings which really provided the scaffolding through which any individual could find the words to articulate most precisely, most poignantly, the core desires and needs of their life. And not just of themselves, but of themselves within society, of themselves as members of the nation, representing the needs of the nation. And when you take a look at these blessings, I mean, they really do cover just about everything on a personal and societal level. So they start with knowledge. And I mean, which one of us doesn't need some of that? And then you've got teshuvah, the desire to return to God and to live faithfully with His Torah. You've got forgiveness for our mistakes. You've got dreams of our ultimate redemption, requests for health, for financial security, for national unity, We ask for the reinstatement of our legal system, guided by the instructions for living the Torah. We talk about the uprooting of evil from all of mankind, for the protection of the righteous, for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the reestablishment of our sovereign ruler. And then finally, we cap it all off that all of our requests, those spoken and those which remain in the heart, too difficult to even mention, all of our requests should be received lovingly by the one who hears all prayers and create the changes that they have the ability to make. I mean, is there any need, any aspiration which doesn't fall into one of those categories? So it was an amazing task. I mean, truly an incredible feat in composing a set of blessings which can allow the nation at large to coalesce with their hearts and their prayers around those words throughout the next 2 millennia. Now, it happens to be that a short while later, after Ezra, in the great academy of Yavne, they established a 19th blessing to be added to the middle section as well. And this was a response to this growing animosity that was developing between reforming sects of the people who were causing tremendous issues throughout the nation. And so these 19 blessings were essentially meant to serve as a scaffolding, not to replace the personal prayer, but to guide the uninitiated into the experience and provide an opening upon which we can each add our own thoughts and expressions into the tefillot. And indeed, we actually find a tremendous stress amongst our tradition, this concept of mechadesh davar b'tfilato, finding something new, some fresh insight into ourselves and what we're after in life, into our prayers. Because to use the blessings as they are, without adding our personal dimension and our own constantly developing understanding into the experience, is really to undermine the very purpose that the blessings were composed for, to allow us to enter into the experience, standing before the Shekhinah and communicating our deepest desires with God. Now, prayer as we know it today goes beyond these 18 blessings of tefillah. The same Supreme Court of Ezra was responsible for the composition of scores of other blessings found throughout Jewish liturgy. Because the same issues we faced when it came to tefillah, the inability to articulate ourselves in the proper and precise way, were also essentially true when it came to blessings throughout the day as well. And so Ezra and his court composed standardized formulas for what we say before the foods that we eat, the pleasures and the life events we experience, the mitzvot that we perform, and the appreciations that we don't even have the words to express on our own. And many of these blessings really became anchored around the daily tefillah. So one great example of this are the blessings that bracket the recital of the Shema. There's a biblical mitzvah, a commandment in the Torah, to recite the 3 paragraphs of Shema each day and every night. And our oral tradition records that we should lead into Shema with 2 distinct blessings, and that following Shema, a blessing about redemption should create this bridge between the Shema and the 18 blessings of Tefillah, the Shemona Esrei. And so Ezra and his court also composed those blessings, known as Yotzer Or and Ahava Rabbah, or Ahavat Olam, the eternal love. And so in doing this, the heart of the prayer experience really became the Shema Tefillah combination, with the blessings linking the two together. And then beyond that, you had a series of blessings that began to be said each morning on things like pleasures of getting out of bed, of having clothing to wear, stretching our legs, of being free. All of these became opportunities to meditate on the gifts of life and connect them into a higher purpose in our relationship with God. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this aspect of prayer, since the truth is that there's really been constant development and change within the category of which blessings we recite at which points in the day. But looking at things sort of in broad strokes, there was definitely a growing opportunity for specific texts to be recited and used as anchors for our experiences at different points in time. So far, so good. But here's where things really began to develop in the daily prayers, in the times during and after the Talmud. Remember that the first element of prayer is shevach, focusing ourselves on the praises of God. So the Talmud writes that a person should always arrange his praises of God, yisader shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before he actually prays. And this was understood by many to mean that before a person even begins the actual tefillah, even the shevach part, let alone the Shema, which is supposed to come before it, we should already begin the build-up towards standing in God's presence. And what praises are these? Well, it happened to be that there are already certain praise-filled chapters of Tehillim, of Psalms, which had already been recommended as daily meditations by the sages of the Talmud. So arranging them together into a lead-up to the tefillah proper really seemed like a no-brainer. And basically, that's how the section of the morning prayers known as the Pesukei de Zimra was born. The content of this section was also subject to development, of course, and they came to be bracketed by these two blessings, Baruch She'amar on one end and Yishtabach on the other. Now, what also happened was that additional prayers were sort of appended to the end of tefillah for a variety of different reasons, depending on which aspect of the prayer we're referring to. In most cases, these were texts which were customarily said on a daily basis anyway. And so as things were continuously concretizing into somewhat of a book of prayer, these kind of each found their place in the way that we segue out of davening. And these were meant to kind of serve as a coming back down, almost a re-entry into life outside of the divine presence. Now, it's kind of difficult to really pin down a moment at which the siddur became what it is today. And arguably, there never really was such a moment, even including today. And that's because when you take a look at prayer books from across the past 1,000 years, there's hardly two which are completely identical. And remember that the establishment of the texts of prayer was always scaffolding, always there to provide the fluidity needed in an authentic audience with God. So as history unfolded and our people faced innumerable struggles and experiences throughout our history, our tefillot always reflected those nuanced changes based on which societies were dealing with which situations. So maybe the need for knowledge and insight would be expressed in one way in a certain locale and another way in a distant country. Or the order of particular verses in the beginning of the prayers would vary based on when and where they were being said. Or a great scholar would maybe compose a poem to be sung during the services, which actually happened quite a bit. And those then became a custom in that society and became ingrained in the prayers. All of these nuanced changes, known as the Nusach HaTfilah, are what account for the existence of so many different prayer books today. But the thing with prayer books is that they actually carry a risk of their own, surprisingly enough. Because the Mishnah in Tractate Brachot tells us that ha'oseh tfilato keva, someone who makes his prayers set, routine, or standardized, ein tfilato tachanunim. His prayers lack that essential feature of sincerity, of truly beseeching God for the answers to our requests. And actually, the great Rabbi Yehuda Loewy of the 16th century, known as the Maharal of Prague, writes in his commentary to the Tractate Avot in chapter 2 that praying from a siddur as opposed to by heart only heightens the risk. I mean, it's like, imagine reading a thank you speech off a paper, or saying those meaningful things to your loved one with a script in front of you. How sincere can that really be? Now, obviously, it's better than nothing, right? I mean, if praying without a siddur means that you won't even know what words to say, or that you'll have no focus at all, then of course, using the book is the way to go. Whatever works to facilitate the focus and the heartfulness of the experience. But there is a risk factor there. And so the Mishnah in Tractate Sotah tells us that prayer can actually take place in any language a person understands, so long as the words used are an accurate reflection of the Hebrew words coined by Ezra in his court. Whatever it takes to retain that tachanunim, that sincerity, the authenticity. Now, of course, it's true. Praying in the original Hebrew, if possible, is certainly ideal. I mean, not only because every translation is essentially a commentary and limits the scope of the words to a narrow interpretation, but there's also a powerful energy within the Hebrew words which really express the concepts of tefillah in an unparalleled fashion. So the ideal situation is really to work on understanding the Hebrew so that you can pray in the language of our ancestors. But in lieu of that, definitely any quality translation does the trick as well. So that's sort of a highly simplified understanding of the history of the development of prayer from its conception of those 18 brachot to the entirety of the siddur that we see today. And obviously, there's a tremendous amount more in each and every one of those details. But I think if we want to think practically about how we can use the experience of prayer, I think that by being mindful of the overarching structure of tefillah and the prayers at large, we can really begin imbuing those prayers with greater meaning. Appreciating tefillah starts with an understanding of what we're doing in tefillah, that we have an audience with God while we're enveloped in this loving presence of the Shekhinah. But it continues with really beginning to understand the meaning of the words, their flow from one to the next, and how each finds its place in the symphony of the siddur. And of course, time is key. You know, the Talmud says that the early pious scholars would spend a complete hour in tefillah, and that was just the 18 blessings. So I read in Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's really beautiful book, Jewish Meditation, that if you run a quick calculation, that averages out to around one word every 7 seconds. And even if we take that to be somewhat of an exaggeration, that's still an amazing difference from many of us who are averaging the exact opposite of 7 words per second instead of one word per every 7 seconds. So we've really got to slow it down and find a pace that works for us. Something that worked for me when I was younger was to take one paragraph each week and really take my time on it, carefully pronouncing every word, which, we usually butcher the pronunciation as we murmur through the prayers under our breath, and make sure to go back and forth between the English and the Hebrew. And each week I would move on to the next paragraph. And after a few months, I really had a far better knowledge, not only of the meaning of the words, but how to properly pronounce them in a clear and accurate way. Another thing, which is really crucial for improving our tefillah experience, is to make it personal. I mean, each blessing speaks personally to our needs and to those of our collective national identity. That's how they were written, by a panel of prophets and geniuses. So as you read through those words, let them be expressive of what you actually feel. If there's someone sick that you know of, have them in mind during the blessing of Rifa'enu. If you're struggling with your financial situation, connect it to the words of Baruch Aleinu. And feel free to freestyle with your own words. I mean, the whole point of the structure is to provide a scaffolding for you to express that inner yearning of the soul, the deepest desires and convictions that you have, the dreams that you want to share with your greatest partner in life, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Another classic way that Jews have tapped into tefillah is finding a tune for the earlier parts of the prayer, which can help you carry through them. And of course, you can always try the classic Jewish thing and shake while you pray. Right? Get moving, feel the energy coursing through you, and really do whatever you can to channel that inner yearning of the soul into your emotions, into your active consciousness, and into the forefront of your relationship with God. So these are some tools that I really do believe have the ability to transform our understanding of tefillah. When we take a look at the scaffolding of prayer, we understand the development of how we got to where we are today. We understand that there were blessings that were constructed by the greatest of the great, by prophets and a panel of a Supreme Court, which understood the needs of every single individual and also understood our collective societal needs, and were able to embed the dreams and aspirations and needs of all of our people into a collection of 18 succinct blessings. And when we understand that there's a development in prayer, that there are the initial blessings as we work our way out of bed in the morning and gain our sort of footing in this world as human beings, as we continue into our kind of build up in a momentum towards the recital of the Shema and ultimately to standing there in the presence of God, and as we see that the final prayers are really meant to help us kind of come back into this world, segue back into the reality that we live in down here, we start to understand that there's something really powerful happening here. There's a dance, there's an orchestration, there's really an incredible symphony which is taking place through the tefillot. And as we begin to really tap into that and we work on that on a daily basis, and make no mistake, it's something which requires daily effort. But if we put in that effort, if we focus in our abilities, we can truly begin to create a space, a kavanat halev, a direction of the heart, wherein there is a direct line of contact between us and the creator of the world. And when it comes down to it, what more could we possibly want? I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. See you all next time. I hope you enjoyed that segment of the Chaim Davies Show. If you did, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, or follow our podcast so you can stay up to date on all our future content.